Right? Now, he's saying that Malachi's talking about a third temple, but that's not true. Malachi's not talking about a temple that, he's talking about the temple that then was. In fact, the passage itself makes it, I mean, the whole context of Malachi's book makes it clear he's talking about the days of the second temple. Look at chapter 2, verse 1. It says, "Now, O priest, this command is for you. If you will not listen, if you will not take it to heart, to give honor to my name, says the Lord of hosts, then I will send the curse upon you, and I will curse your blessings. Indeed, I have already cursed them, because you do not lay it to heart. Behold, I'll rebuke your offspring and spread dung on your faces, the dung of your offerings, and you shall be taken away with it." Right? So this is not a prophecy about a third temple. This is a prophecy that is relevant in Malachi's day, and that will be all the more relevant when the time of its ultimate fulfillment comes, which is with the coming of the Messiah, the coming of the two messengers, and so forth. So anyways, Funk Dude was trying as hard as he could to make it a reference to a third temple, and I simply reject that whole idea, at least when it comes to Malachi. But he kept going to Ezekiel, and this is why I brought up the issue of God appearing in human form and God being tripersonal, because that was our original discussion, right? So he goes to Ezekiel, and I brought up the fact that God appears to the prophet Ezekiel in chapter 1 and chapter 10 in the form of a man, right? Okay, because again, remembering, this is the starting point of our discussion that he was trying to avoid. And so I said, look, if you're not going to accept Ezekiel when it comes to chapter 1 and chapter 10, then I'm not going to listen to your nonsense about Ezekiel 40 through 48 and a third temple. Right? If you don't accept the book, then don't expect me to, play your game. Right? Makes sense? I mean, I'm just saying that if I'm beholden to accept what Ezekiel says in chapter 40 through 48, then he's beholden to accept chapter 1 and chapter 10. And of course, I wouldn't reject Ezekiel because he does. I'm just saying, tit for tat, you shoot my dog, I'll kill your cat. Turnabout's fair play. If he wants to ignore critical evidence in Ezekiel, then he can't expect that I'm going to be, feeling like I'm pressured to deal with some, horrible problem in Ezekiel 4. I don't think there's a problem there at all, anyways. But I don't know that we really got to discuss what Ezekiel 40 through 48 is talking about. But one thing that's interesting is I know that Ezekiel was one of the books that did pose just like we had debates about what books would be included in the New Testament, there were some Jewish individuals who questioned the authority, the canonical authority of Ezekiel principally because of what it says in chapters 40 through 48. The measurements of the temple there don't seem to square with the original measurements, right? So they had a problem with that. They didn't quite know how that meshed. And I don't remember the whole discussion of all that. But the point is there's something interesting going on there. And, so I don't know why Funk Dude thought that was a place of refuge. I don't think it is, but I'd have to hear him actually give me his argument. But one point that I kept making is, look, Funk Dude, your temple's gone. It's been gone for 2,000 years. The proof is in the pudding. Okay, you can reject my interpretation. I'm arguing that Jesus is the fulfillment of the temple, its symbolism, and so on and so forth. Right? That's my argument. Now, you can claim my argument's wrong, but go look on Google Earth and tell me if you see a temple over there. Right? And then what I want you to do is tell me why there hasn't been one for 2,000 years. Tell me why there hasn't been a temple since the first century, since the time period in which Jesus came, right? Tell me why there's been no temple there. When you look in the Old Testament, and it predicts the destruction of the first temple, there was a prophetic announcement that it was going to be destroyed in advance of its destruction, right? In the book of Amos, it says God doesn't do anything without revealing his will to his servants, the prophets, right? The destruction of the first temple was predicted. And, moreover, their sin was revealed. They knew why it was going to be destroyed because, again, the prophets came and told them exactly why it was going to happen. And then thirdly, they were told how long this punishment would last. That's why Daniel could read the book of Jeremiah and then turn in prayer to God, realizing that the end of the 70 years was almost completed, right? Because Jeremiah had said that in 70 years, all these things would, their punishment would be coming to an end, right? And so Daniel sets his face to prayer, and he prays for God for the return of the exiles and, of course, the rebuilding of the temple. So all of this stuff was predicted, and Daniel had clear revelation. I mean, of course, he was a prophet as well, but I'm saying he wasn't the only prophet. He could look into the prophets that were contemporaneous with him and prior to him and know why the temple was destroyed and when the period of their punishment would end. Now, what Jew today could identify the sin that was committed that led to the destruction of the second temple, and what Jew today can point to the prophetic statement that indicates when the punishment will cease? Right? There isn't any. They have to come up with some, and I've heard them say, these very, yeah, I know it's something vague, like, I forget, I'm trying to remember what it was. Refresh my memory. It's like, it's not something specific, but it's like, gosh, hate without a cause. I mean, yeah. But you know what's interesting though? When you look at the Old Testament, when it talks about the reasons given for the destruction of the first temple, the reason given is because they rejected God's servants, the prophets, whom He sent to them, right? Calling them back to obedience to Mosaic law, right? Now, what is the parable that Jesus gives when Jesus talks about their coming judgment? He gives the story of a vine owner renting out his vineyard to a group of people, and then when it was time to collect his proceeds, he sent his servants to them, right? And then they mistreated his servants, so he sent another deputation of servants, and they did the same thing to them. They killed some, they stoned, they beat others. And then what does the vine owner say? He says, or the vineyard owner, he says, last of all, I'll send my son, right? And then Jesus says to them, last of all, he sent his son, saying they'll respect my son. And then Jesus said that they take the son, they say, let's take his inheritance, throw him out of the vineyard. And he says, what do you think the vineyard owner is going to do to those who treat his son in this way? And they said, well, because they think this is just this idle parable, they say, well, he'll destroy those wretches, right? And he'll bring them to a bitter end. And then Jesus said, he quotes the psalm or the passage where it talks about the stone that the builders rejected has become the capstone. The Lord has done this, and it's marvelous in our eyes. And then we're told that the religious leaders reacted violently, basically, not that they physically did anything to Jesus, but they wanted to kill him because they understood that he was talking about them. Right? So they understood that the parable Jesus told along the pattern of the Old Testament, right? Just like the Old Testament said that the temple was going to be destroyed because they had rejected the prophets and were refusing to return to obedience to the law of God. Jesus tells a parable along those very lines, and they understand that he's saying they're going to be destroyed along with their temple, and they'll be ejected from the land, vomited from the land, because last of all, they're going to do the same thing to God's Son. And so, anyways, my point is, you've got this prophetic precedent for what Christians are talking about. Funkdude rejects our interpretation, and yet the proof is in the pudding. There is no temple. It simply isn't there, and it hasn't been there for 2,000 years. Right, he has no better explanation, and moreover, the Christian interpretation is analogous to the original destruction of the first temple. Right? It's the same pattern. And it was predicted by Jesus before it happened. And so here's my point. There's this great line in Isaiah that I love. You know the section in Isaiah that's referred to as the trial of the gods? In Isaiah 40 through 45, God throws down the gauntlet, and he's challenging the false gods and the idols to do something, whether good or bad, to prove that they're actually deities, right? Well, one of the things that God says is he tells the false gods that the nation was worshiping, he says, do something, whether good or bad, so that we can see that you're gods. And he says, tell us what you're going to do so that when it happens, right, we can say, oh yes, you're God's, right? And then God turns around and he says, I've told you these things in advance, so that when they happen, you can't then turn around and say, my idol did it, right? In other words, God is staking his claim on this, his ability to tell these things in advance. By doing that, he's proclaiming himself to be the sovereign God who's sovereign over the future, right? God can bring his purposes to pass. By announcing these things in advance, he's proving when it does happen that he in fact is God, so that the people can't turn around and say, oh no, this was done by my idol, because their idol didn't predict these things, right? So the point that I'm making is, since Jesus in the New Testament predicts the destruction of the temple because of their rejection of him, then the God who declares the future is the God who proves himself to be the God of the future. Right? The funk dude can come along in the name of his anti-messianic conception of God and say that his God is the one who is in charge of the scene, but his God didn't tell us anything. Now understand, don't misunderstand me, I obviously think that the God of the New Testament is the same as the God of the Old Testament, but I don't believe that those who reject Christ truly are believing in the God of the Old Testament. I think they're apostate from him, right? The only true Jews are those Jews, like Nacdamon, who believe in the Messiah as the incarnate Son of the Father, right? So, anyways, long story short, Jesus told these things in advance. When Funk Dude comes along with his, Unitarian deity, who has nothing to do with the Old Testament, much less the New, his God didn't tell us any of these things. The true God did, and his temple's gone. And Google Earth is my proof. Forget Wikipedia, go to Google Earth. No, I'm kidding. Go ahead, NetBeast.